Dr. Jazz.
Appreciate it.
Dr. Jazz.
Sure.
It's good timing since the new record is out. So, and
So you've heard the new
oh
Vital
man,
Information album, Time for
yeah. I mean, I listened today, funnily enough, to the first one from '83, and then to the last one just to get in the mood. And I
Oh,
was like,
okay.
man, it's like 40 years between, and
Right.
such different music as well. But and you're so creative still, which is amazing. Um, and I just want to start this talk with the new one. I mean, uh, first of all, the musicians. I mean, I know all of them, obviously, but how did you first your trio with Manuel and Yannick? How did you get with those two together, and when was that?
Well, I had played with Yannick a number of times over the years, first with Mike Stern on tour.
Oh, really?
So
Oh,
we
wow.
did
Okay.
we did a European tour. It was a quartet with Randy Brecker, Mike Stern, and Yannick and myself. And I was just very impressed with his playing, and I knew he was fun and easy to be on tour with as well. And then a few other times I worked with him. He was the bass player at this drum fantasy camp, this drum camp that I do every so often. And then my bass player of 20 years, Baron Brown,
Yeah.
he had a stroke in early 2020, and I had some gigs, and I had Yannick come in as a sub to do those gigs. So that's how I met Yannick, and then I met Manuel through Vinny Valentino.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
And because they played together in New York City, and Manuel lives in New York, and I had a health problem with some of the guys in the group, and my keyboard player had a health problem and couldn't make some dates, so Vinny recommended Manuel, and Manuel came in and did an incredible job. And then, as it turned out, this is right when COVID started to happen, and I was on tour with Vital Information.
Oh, shit. Okay.
And then Vinny couldn't make it to our gigs in Australia. So Manuel and I went to Australia, and we found a local bass player in Melbourne, and we played for a week in Melbourne as a trio. And that was a revelation, because usually I've had a quartet or quintet. And then with Manuel, he's not only a great acoustic piano player, but he really knew how to orchestrate with the synths. He could play the melodies and the harmony at the same time, and covered a lot of bases. So it felt really pretty great as a trio. And then, then we came home, because then I had a tour of Japan and China right after that, and that was March 2020. So then things shut down for a couple of years. And when it was time to get back to recording and touring, I had decided, let's try this as a trio with Manuel and Yannick, because they're both virtuoso soloists, and as a trio, everyone needs to carry that weight of not only being a good accompanist but also being a good soloist, so you can present a night of music and keep it varied, and it's been working out pretty great, really fantastic.
Yeah, beautiful that now you're like the older guy, the band leader, and now you can present also the younger musicians, and I really like that. That's like
Yes,
what jazz was
exactly.
all about for years,
Yep.
right? So
Yeah.
Where does George Garzone come into the equation? Where did you play with him? I was so surprised to see George on this record. I don't know why,
Yeah.
but somehow I didn't connect you guys, but it sounds amazing, by the way, the connection.
Yeah, thank you. So, well, I went to the Berklee College of Music in 1972, and I was there on and off for 4 years, from 72 to 76. And during that time, I played with George quite a bit.
Okay.
For about a year, I played drums in his group called The Fringe.
Oh, really?
Which,
oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, which is, it's a trio, it's acoustic bass. And the bass player at the time that I did it was Rich Appleman, who is the head of the Berklee bass department. John Lockwood came in a little later, and I was playing with John Lockwood in other groups, but the Fringe was George Garzone and Rich Appleman and myself for a while. He also, the main drummer was Bob Galati, who had played with him in that group for many years. But, so I was initiated in some ways to like very free playing with George in that kind of environment. And then we played there was another group, there was a band called Baird Hersey in the Year of the Ear. And we used to play Pooh's Pub and, the different venues around Boston in the early mid 70s. And then, and I stayed in touch with George, and then I lost touch with him for quite a few years. And what got me going was two things. Was I heard George on Peter Erskine's album, just like live in LA, 3-disc set. And he sounded so great on that. And then Baird Hersey, the band leader that had this band Year of the Ear, called me to play on a record. And I hadn't played with Baird in over 40 years. And so that was kind of out of the blue, but I went and played on the record. And then he was having George play on the record as well. And that's how I got back in touch with George. And since it is the 40th, or was the 40th anniversary of Vital Information, I wanted to have some special guests that made sense to me. And I always loved playing with saxophone players, and I hadn't really recorded with George. So we invited him down for the afternoon. And the other person that, I want to mention was Mike Maneri, that, I played with Steps Ahead for many years. So I wanted Mike on the album too. So he's on one tune. And we were going to have George play on like 1 or 2 tunes, and the McCoy Tyner tune called Inception, and he came down and we recorded Inception, and then he just started saying, well, let's jam, let's do this, let's do that, and so we spent something like 3 hours, and in that 3 hours we recorded an entire album of improvised music with George. And I think the spirit of his creativity and spontaneous personality inspired us. And we're all good improvisers, even, creating from nothing. And that's that. So when you get the Time Flies CD, it's actually a double CD, because it's got this, A Prayer for the Generations, which is this entirely improvised yet very cohesive second album that comes with it.
Yeah, it's so nice to hear you in this context, you as a drummer also, because I think I haven't heard you a lot in this context, like more in a sense open, yet still, like you said, cohesive. So it's really nice to hear you that, especially with George, I'm such a fan of his. He's such an underrated player in a sense. I mean, among the musicians community, of course, it's hugely known.
Yes, he is. Yeah. I mean, I think he's not, wouldn't say underrated, but he's not as that well known.
Yeah.
As some, some of his contemporaries, but he is a world-class, incredible saxophone player.
Yeah. Will you do some gigs also when promoting the album with George or with Mike, or?
No, just with the trio.
Okay.
Yeah.
Would be cool. Otherwise.
It would be, but it's not that easy to get out on tour and to get gigs, and then as a trio financially, it works pretty well that way. And, so, and I'm just, dealing with that reality as well.
Sure. Yeah. You mentioned McCoy Tyner's Inception, and how did you choose the repertoire for the group? Because it's like, I love that you play Bud Powell and some other stuff like Self-Portrait by Mike, but how did you choose the repertoire for the record? I mean,
how did we choose the repertoire? Well, we had played some gigs as a trio before the album. We played at Birdland for a few days and did a little bit of touring. And during that time, most of those arrangements came out. They developed. And Manuel really has the large hand in coming up with the arrangements. And without spending a lot of time jamming and hanging out and trying to write music together, that's one of the reasons why we recorded some jazz standards versus all original. Like in past Vital Information albums, I'd have a working band, and we would be able to have time to get together and everyone write together, or Tom Coster or Vinnie Valentino, or somebody would contribute songs, but without, we just didn't have that luxury to get together and compose together. We did a little bit of that. Manuel and I did a little bit of that with this tune called Choreography in Six. We were able to get together in New York and do that, but Yannick lives in LA, and and they're very busy. Yannick is busy in LA, and he's busy raising his daughter with his wife. That's a big full-time job for him. And Manuel teaches at NYU, and so we didn't have that luxury, so we came up with this repertoire that feels really good to play, and those guys are both fans of Steps Ahead, and that's how Manuel suggested Self-Portrait. So we just started playing it. I wasn't planning on recording it, but it sounded so good. Then we recorded that, but as a trio without Mike, and so it's I'm just very pleased with how that album came out.
Yeah, it's beautiful. I mean, like I said, it's such a nice record, and it's so nice to hear you guys. It's really like a unit, and
yes,
beautiful.
It is.
But I wanted to ask you. You have a piano behind you, and do you still compose otherwise, or are you? What has been your composition? Because I know in the early days you did, right, of Vital Information.
I did. Yeah, I did, and I did. Play piano and took lessons in high school and played at Berkeley, and then, played after that and did quite a bit of composing. But, what put me off doing that is that my piano technique is so limited that eventually it just became too frustrating. But what took its place is that I started doing what I did with Journey, and the way Journey would write music is everybody, we just get in a room and start jamming, and everyone would come up with parts, which would end up, in the end, we'd formulate that into a song, and that I can do pretty readily, come up with a rhythmic framework for a song that is, coming from a compositional idea on the drum set, and then presenting that and having the other players do what they do, which is come up with a bass line, come up with some harmony, come up with melody, and compose like that. And I think it was in the mid 90s, I started doing that with Vital Information, just saying, look, to Frank Gambale, Baron Brown, and Tom Coster, let's write like this. And Tom Coster had a lot of experience with that because that's the way Santana would write music. And then Baron and Frank really hadn't had much experience with that idea, but they quickly adapted to it. So in those mid 90s into the early 2000s, a lot of that vital information music was written in a rehearsal room, or just like what we did with George and Manuel and Yannick, right in the studio, just improvising, starting with a drum groove or starting with a bass line or anything would do to get us going, and then just go from there. So that's where I put my energy, into this kind of collective group writing.
Yeah. No,
and I did a lot of, not just the vital information records, but I did this whole series of albums labeled called Tone Center.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you that later, but yeah.
Yeah, and that started with Victor Wooten and Scott Henderson, and basically that's how we wrote that entire record, and then the records with Frank Gambale and Stu Ham, and with Larry Coryell and Tom Cosser. We just, I took that idea, and some people might have been skeptical at first, but it works. If everyone's open and ready to contribute and then collaborate on writing together.
Yeah. How did those albums happen, by the way? Like, because the lineups are always incredible, and I'm a guitarist, so I have those records, obviously, all of them. But
yeah,
how did those lineups occur? Like, what was the occasion?
Well, Mike Varney is the person that owned Shrapnel Records, and I had played on a number of, like, Vinnie Moore and Richie Kotzen and Tony McAlpine, and these really impressive shredder rock guitar.
I also want to ask you about that, how you ended on those records, by the way.
Yeah, it was Mike Varney. So I was living in the San Francisco Bay Area at the time, and Mike called me the first album I made for him was the Tony McAlpine Edge of Insanity.
Yeah, I remember. I have that, actually.
Yeah, and those records were like super low budget, like $5,000 for the whole record. So what we would do is, Tony McAlpine came to my house, and he had these demo tapes of him playing everything, bass, keyboards, guitar, and drums. So so I learned that whole album using his demos as a model, and then we rehearsed for like a day or something, and then we went in the studio, and in like 1.5 day recorded that whole album. Yeah. And that's how Mike Varney and I started to work together. So he called me in 1997 and to sort of set up where I was at that time. In 1995 and 96 and into 97, there was a Journey reunion and an album called Trial by Fire, and I hadn't played with Journey for, I think, 11 years before that. There was this pretty big gap from 1985 to 95, 96. And I had to sign this contract that said that I couldn't play with anyone else during that time, which was I didn't like that at all, but I did it because that was part of the deal of doing this reunion album. And then we waited a long time to tour, and then, as it turned out, we never did tour. So I had this kind of frustration creatively, that when Mike Varney called me, and I was ready to go through a very creative period, which is what happened. He said, can you put together a trio of any, like a guitar, bass, drums trio, anything that you can think of? What would you do? That was his question. And so I thought Scott Henderson and Victor Wooten. So I didn't know Victor Wooten, but I had heard his first solo album, which was just a solo bass album, and that blew me away. And so he was somebody that I had on my radar. And then Scott Henderson and I had worked together a lot earlier. because I think it was 1985 or 1986. I played on Jeff Berlin's first solo record called Champion.
Champion, yeah,
and that had Scott Henderson and then we started a group called Players with T. Lavitz,
exactly,
and Jeff Berlin and myself, and so I love playing with Scott. Great, bop and roller, but I hadn't played with him in years, so I thought of those guys. So he says, "Well, call him up and let's make it happen." Mike Varney said, "Call him up," which I did. And then at the time, again, like I was saying, I lived in Marin County, and my home there, I had built a studio, like a nice 24-track studio with 2-inch tape, like this is before digital, and the guys just came to my house and we hung out for a week.
Oh, beautiful. And
jammed every day and made that album. And once that first album was done, that Vital Tectones, Mike Varney decided not to put it on Shrapnel Records. He came up with the idea, I'm going to start a new label, a fusion label. And his idea was that at the time, smooth jazz was very popular. And he wanted to be the complete other end of the scale of smooth jazz. He said, let's make records for those people that don't like smooth jazz, that want to buy like something from Mahavishnu Orchestra or Return to Forever or something, completely the opposite of smooth jazz. So that sounded good to me. So he says, think of another trio. And then I came up with Frank Mbali and Stu Ham, because I had worked with both of them and put them in it. We put them together, and it just kept going from there.
What about with Larry Coryell? Did you play with him before?
Larry Coryell. I had worked with Larry a little bit. Larry he came to the Bay Area with no band, and he'd hire a local rhythm section, and that's how I met Larry. He hired me and George Brooks and Kai Eckhart. And we played some jazz festivals, and so I like playing with Larry, and I appreciated Larry's history.
Yeah,
because as a history student, Larry and John McLaughlin, in a way, they're one from the U.S., one from England, played a similar role in both cultures of being like right on the cutting edge of this jazz rock scene in the
Gary Burton,
60s. And I saw his band called the 11th House. When I was fortunate to see a lot of these groups living in Boston. They'd play at the Jazz Workshop or Paul's Mall. So I was a fan as well, and so I got him and Tom Coster together, and that was the first like a trio. And then we did a group with Steve Marcus, and I didn't really know that, like, I was working with Steve Marcus with the Buddy Rich Big Band and with this group Buddies that I had put together. And well, actually, I didn't put Buddies together. That it was put together by Kathy Rich originally, and then it in a way became its own entity, separate from that Buddy Rich estate. But I was working with Steve Marcus, and as it turned out, he had a long history with Larry Coryell that I didn't know about, but then I learned about. There was a band, they had a band called Count's Rock Band with Bob Moses.
Oh, I played with Bob last year, man.
Bob Moses and Larry Coryell and Steve Marcus. And there's a couple albums by that name with those guys. And they played together a lot during that jazz rock period in the late 60s. So, it was good to put those two together because they hadn't played together in many years. And also, now that we're talking about those Tone Center records, one of the most interesting is the one called The Stranger's Hand.
Oh, man. Whew. Yeah.
With O'Teal Burbridge and Howard Levy.
Howard, yeah, man. How did you meet Howard? Because I'm a good friend with Howard for years, and we did a tour together and everything. How did you come up with Howard? Through Victor Wooten or?
It could have been. That's a good question. Now I don't really remember exactly how I met him. So, but I met Jerry Goodman through Howard Levy, since they were both Chicago. They were, Chicago based, and it could have been through Victor Wooten, but yeah, that's funny. I don't really remember how we met, but that's that started out actually really. It was supposed to be David Sanchez
Ah, really?
and
Oh, wow. Okay.
and O'Teal and myself, and David was going to play guitar and keyboards, but then something happened and he couldn't make it. He just had to cancel, and so since we were already booked and the time was set aside, we came up with this other idea with Howard Levy and Jerry Goodman, and that turned into this very interesting
Amazing
album,
record. Yeah.
quite unique.
Yeah. Yeah. He's so good, Howard. Like,
Yeah,
he has this small instrument, the same as, not chromatic, but like the same as, let's say, Bob Dylan plays, yet
right.
rhythmically he's amazing, and it's really nice to hear you guys together, because
Yeah, and then I
it's
continued
amazing.
to work. Yeah, I did some more work with Howard. Like, he subbed for Tom Coster in Vital Information when Tom couldn't make some gigs, and then Jerry Goodman and Howard invited me to go on tour playing some Indian music with an Indian tabla player in
Oh, really? I
2001.
didn't know that. Wow.
Yeah, and it was with Paul Bolenbach and
Oh, wow.
Victor Bailey.
Wow.
It was a really good group, and that's my introduction to Indian
Indian.
music. That's how I first started to learn about Indian rhythms. At that time, playing with those guys, because they knew I could play odd time signatures, and so I ended up doing a tour that actually the tour ended on 9/11. It was, we had many more dates, but after that everyone went home. And but it did got my foot in the door of being interested in Indian music, Indian rhythms per se.
Yeah, that's a beast. I'm afraid to go there always. I'm like, shit, it's too big. But you mentioned odd meters. How did you become interested in odd meters? Well, when was that moment? Like mid-70s, like, or earlier even?
Odd meters was just a very natural thing that goes all the way back to high school when I was.
Oh, okay.
I took, I'm a musician that had a lot of private lessons. I grew up with a drum taking lessons from a drum teacher. Like when I started playing the drums, I was in the 4th grade. Actually, what I started with the snare drum, and my parents brought me to a teacher in Brockton, Massachusetts. I lived in Whitman. It's just the next town over, and this is just like 25 miles south of Boston. And so I started with a teacher. So the teacher was a jazz drummer, and he taught me in all the fundamentals of rudiments, and then jazz drumming coordination. And then by the time I was in high school, we were, he's odd time reading texts, Louis Bell's Odd Time book, and there was a lot of snare drum books written with odd time signatures. And then of course, Mahavishnu Orchestra came out in 71, 72. I was, just graduating high school in 72. So, and I'd play along with the record. So it wasn't a stretch to play in odd times. And in fact, and then at school at Berkeley, I would jam with people like Jeff Berlin, Jamie Glazer, and I used to jam at Berkeley in odd times. And when I auditioned for Jean-Luc Ponty in 1976, while I was still a student, at the audition, I had to read some charts of his music, and then he wanted to just play duet with me in 7, on duets in 5, and just check out my odd time playing. So, and I could do it. It was just a natural thing.
Yeah.
And so that's, that odd times go all the way back to to close to the beginning of me playing drums.
Wow. How did you end up on that audition, by the way? I mean, I wanted to ask you about, Jean-Luc, and especially Allan, your connection with Allan, if you guys played together, and how much, and how was he like for you? I mean, he's one of my heroes,
Sure. Well, let's go back to how I got on the audition. Is that Jean-Luc needed a drummer quickly. He had a drummer named Mark Cranny that played on the album called Imaginary Voyage, and Mark Cranny left to join Tommy Bolin's band, left Jean-Luc to go on tour with Tommy Bolin. And so Ponty auditioned drummers in LA, and then he came to New York to audition drummers, and he didn't bring his bass player, who at the time was Tom Fowler. He knew about Jeff Berlin, and he asked Jeff if he could be the bass player at the audition. And Jeff and I had played together a lot at Berkeley, so Jeff suggested that I be one of the drummers that auditioned. So I came down to New York and did that audition and got the gig. And about 4 days later, I was in LA rehearsing with Jean-Luc and about to go on tour.
Wow, that's amazing.
And then as far as Allan Holdsworth, of course, I saw him with Tony Williams. I think I saw him, that band, 3 different times.
Oh, wow.
Twice in Boston and once in Chicago, which was mind-blowing to, be in the room with those musicians. And when I first joined Ponty's band, it was Alan Zavad on keyboards and Tom Fowler on bass and Daryl Sturmer on guitar. And Jean-Luc, and there's actually a video of my second gig.
Oh wow, I have to check it out.
It's on Soundstage. Soundstage was a PBS show, I think, based in Chicago, and there's a video of us playing, I don't know, like 20 minutes of music.
Okay.
And that was the second gig. We did a club gig somewhere, and then that TV show. And I do a duet with Jean-Luc in 7 on that. And when Jean-Luc wrote the music for Enigmatic Ocean, he had it in mind to have 2 guitars, and he wanted Allan Holdsworth to be the second guitar player. So that's, we rehearsed. It's hard for me. I can't really remember exactly, but I think we rehearsed a lot, like maybe for a week.
Wow. Yeah.
And Ponty, he didn't have demos or anything. He had charts, and he had like a chart lead sheet for me. So when we rehearsed, there was nothing to go on except for our creativity. So he'd give us the chart, but then we came up with our parts, and I, came up with the drum parts for that album just as one would in a big band. They hand out the chart and you just come up with a part. And so we rehearsed, and then I think we spent 4 days in the studio, and everything that's played is live.
Wow.
There was some editing, as far as I remember, especially those suites, because there was like 2 suites, and we'd play like part 1, then stop, and part 2, part 3. Actually, the other thing about that album, it's the only time I've ever done that. We recorded the album exactly in the sequence that it is on the album.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So he had the whole thing planned out, and we just started at the beginning and recorded all of that music just as it's presented on the record.
Wow.
And so then Allan was supposed to come on tour with us, and he played 1 gig with that band, and I don't know why, but I don't think he enjoyed playing that music with the band, and he just disappeared.
Oh wow, man!
He was gone. And so Jean-Luc said, "Well, I need a second guitar player," and I recommended Jamie Glazer.
Okay.
Because the 2 of us had played together a lot at Berkeley, and Jamie's one of the very few guitar players that can really read music.
Yeah, okay.
Really read music, like, You know, like you could put a chart in front of him and he can read it, sight read it.
Well, yeah.
And so he came in and there was an audition with a few guitar players, but Jamie, you know, he really killed it. And so he became the guitar player, second guitar player with Jean-Luc during that time that I was in that group with him. And then he's continued to work with Jean-Luc for many, many years after that.
Oh, interesting.
But I did get to work with Allan later. I'm pretty sure it was 1988. There was a band that was put together called Jazz Explosion.
Oh yeah, with Randy and Stanley, right? That one.
Yes.
How was that like?
It was, Randy Brecker, Stanley Clark,
Yeah.
and Allan Holdsworth and myself. Sometimes Ayrto would play with us.
Wow.
Yeah, that was fantastic. That was a great group. I think, we played well together and put on some very good shows, very good concerts. And it was just a pleasure to play with, that level of musicians. So and we did a lot of gigs in that year. We'd go out for 2 or 3 days, like for the weekend, and then come home.
Oh.
And then we'd meet at wherever, the next set of gigs were. So it's a pretty great situation. And out of that, I ended up working quite a bit with Randy Brecker after that.
Yeah.
Because both Allan and Randy asked me to go on tour with them. But I was more inclined to play with Randy than Allan. And yeah, I think it's like I really enjoy playing straight ahead. I like playing
fusion. It's kind of yeah.
And I like that, but like it was in Allan's group, it's very much like fusion, very kind of free fusion. Whereas with Randy, he had just done an album called In the Idiom with Al Foster on drums. And, it was more straight ahead, and it was, in that way, more what I was interested in. So, and then since I've continued to play with Randy, even into the last couple of years, I've played with him.
Beautiful. Yeah. But I mean, you played with Mike before, obviously in Steps Ahead, right? And
yes, that's right.
How was Mike like to play? I mean, obviously it's a stupid question, but still, like for you, your view. I mean,
that was truly that group, and that was 1986, and I had just left Journey in 1985, and I was out doing clinics. Because, both Zildjian and Sonar had been trying to get me to do some clinics during this whole period that I was with Journey from 78 to 85. But during that period with Journey, we worked almost year round. Like there was literally not much time off. A little bit of time off. And of course, during some time off, I was able to make that first Vital Information record and the second Vital Information record, do some touring with Vital Information. But there wasn't much time for me to do clinics. But after, I left in 85, there was, I was doing like a pretty extensive clinic tour. And one of the clinics was in the Philadelphia area, and it was with Peter Erskine and Lenny White. And there were a few other drummers there, the Jerry Brown and Kenwood Denard was also there. But I was sitting backstage with Peter, and Peter explained like, well, I just quit Steps Ahead because I'm going to go back and play with Joe Zawinul with the Weather Update. And then and Lenny said, yeah, I know they called me for the gig, but I'm too busy and I couldn't do it. So I said to Lenny, why, I need a gig, man. I'd love to do that, because I was a huge fan. And so he called Mike Brecker and Maneri and recommended me. And the next day I got a call from both of those guys. Sure. So when the clinic tour was over, I went to New York and started rehearsing, and we started playing gigs. So that band was with Daryl Jones on bass, and Mike Maneri on vibes, Mike Brecker on Iwi and tenor saxophone, and Mike Stern on guitar, who I played a lot with at Berkeley, and he's on my first Vital Information record. And that group was really powerful. And you know, we were playing jazz, but it was like very deep rooted R&B, funk, rock, jazz. It was pretty killer. And Mike Brecker was, you know, he was mind blowing to play with, especially, you know, some duets. You know, we would do some drum and bass duets. So that was a true musical high point for me to play with that group and to play with all of those guys, but especially Mike.
I love that, especially that lineup with the Daryl and Mike, both mics. I mean, 3 mics actually. So But Steve, not to take too much of your time, I just wanted to ask you, you know, we mentioned the first record already before, and how did that one happen actually in the midst of your, you know, touring and playing, and how did you decide for that moment? And especially, you know, Dean Brown and Mike Stern and Tim, it's such a great band. And how did that happen actually?
Okay, well, Tim Landers and David Volcheski, the original saxophone player with Vital Information, Tim being, you know, a bass player, we had been playing together since high school.
Oh, wow.
Now, we didn't go to the same high school. We went to different high schools, but we were playing in a community big band together while we were in high school. So the Bridgewater State College had a big band, and they didn't have enough college students to really fill out the band. So they recruited some high school players. So Tim got recruited to play bass. He was from Brockton. Dave Wilczewski from Stoughton, Mass, and then myself from Whitman. And so that's how the 3 of us met. And so we played in this big band. But then after that, when we went to college, Tim and I both went to Berkeley. David went to New England Conservatory. We still got together to play gigs. And during time off, Tim would tour with Al Di Meola or Billy Cobham, and I was out touring with Ronnie Montrose or Jean-Luc or Journey. We would get back together in Boston and just play some gigs for fun. And we'd use different guitar players. Daryl Sturmer played with us one year because I had met him with Jean-Luc. Barry Finnerty played with us. And Dean Brown played with us, and you know, so we had this thing going where we would get together and just have some fun because we all enjoyed playing. And those tunes that are on the first album, we played, like most of those tunes we had been playing for a while. And after being in Journey for a few years, I was able to get a record deal on Columbia Records. And I wanted to do a solo record, as you know, as they're called when you're playing in a band like that, and you can get a deal. So I went to Herbie Herbert, our manager, and said, I really want to make an album, a jazz record, and I have a group that, you know, it was ready made. And then Mike Stern was playing with Miles at that time. And so I coordinated my schedule with everyone's schedule, including Mike's schedule with Miles. And it was January of 1983, we could meet, and we recorded in Rhode Island because Tim knew about this studio in Rhode Island, and it was close to where we all grew up. So we got together and spent a week. And you could live at the studio. I had like an apartment upstairs. So we just lived there and made that first album. And again, it's all live, you know, a little bit of overdubs, but really it's pretty much all live. And then that year I toured with Journey. 1983, we did the Frontiers tour, and that ended in September. And then I had a very extensive US tour with Vital Information right after.
Crazy.
And Mike Stern couldn't make that tour, so we got a guitarist named Afe Albers. Yeah, he's on the second album that's called Orion. And I had met Afe Albers. He's, you know, from Holland. In 1977, I think it was. There's a Dutch group called Focus.
Yeah. Oh,
and
yeah. Sure.
And the leader of the band is Thijs van Leer, who plays organ, flute, and yodels. And he came to see Jean-Luc Ponty when we were touring Europe, and he asked me to come to Europe and make a record with Focus. So I did do that, and this was during the time I was playing with Ponty. And the guitar players in Focus were Philippe Catherine and Afe Albers, both of them incredible jazz.
Yeah, Philippe is,
yeah. And after that, I toured a little with Philippe, and then I had Afe come and play with Vital Information, and you can hear him on the second album, Orion. And he's a great bop and roller. You know, he's like plays with a big rock sound, but really can play jazz, you know, bebop style over changes. So which is the kind of guitar player that, you know, I love playing with musicians, that guitar players especially like that.
Yeah, interesting. How have you, like, if you look now, like from 1983 to now, developed as a band leader in your years and eyes, you know, when you started, if you look it back and now, like, is it easy for you to lead a band? I mean, now obviously it is, but like
it's pretty easy for me to lead a band, because my concept is it's surround myself with musicians that I enjoy playing with and hanging out with, and then we collectively come up with music. Yeah. And let's say I would compare myself to, like, let's say Jean-Luc Ponty. That's a very different kind of he's a different kind of band leader. He is a composer, and he writes music, and then he needs players to play his music. And that's not my concept. So I'm not playing music that I've written from 30 or 40 years ago. Like, every group that I put together plays the music of that group.
Yeah,
and so my idea is, just like I said, get the right people together and let's make music together. And so it's you know, I have the last word, and I usually, for the most part, put the set list together and produce the albums, and but I'm a good collaborator, and I find other people that are good collaborators, and that's how I that's how I'm a band leader.
Yeah. It's a team sport, right? So
yeah.
Yes. Do we have otherwise, just to end with, like, plans for this year to come to Europe with this trio, or only States, US tours, or what are the plans, I mean, for you for the upcoming months? And
no plans for Europe at this point.
Oh, come on.
Yeah. But US, we're gonna play a Midwest tour in June, and then some East Coast dates in April. And we do have a tour of China in May. So, and then the ending part of the year, I end up playing at Birdland for about 4 or 5 weeks in a row.
Whoa!
With different groups, with about 4 different groups. And so that's, if you go to vitalinformation.com, my website, that most of those tour dates are posted at this point.
Also for this Birdland, like, it's going to be your groups, like different variations of Vital Information, or?
No. Okay. So Vital Information is playing at Birdland in July.
Okay.
Of 2024.
Yeah.
2024. And but then each week that I play at Birdland, it's organized by Milan Simic, he's like a producer, a music producer, and he puts these groups together. So, and they're tribute type groups. So we're going to play like a tribute to Ornette Coleman, and that's going to be with Donnie McCaslin and Ben Allison trio.
Man, that's killing. Okay.
Yeah, and then we'll do like a Bud Powell tribute, and that'll be Manuel Valera and Lonnie Plaxico.
Wow.
And then there's a Monk, Thelonious Monk tribute, and I think it's Jimmy Green on saxophone, and it could be Ben Allison. At this point, I don't remember but there's a lot of different lineups playing different music from great jazz musicians that have a incredible body of work. And I've been doing this it's been going on for like 4 or 5 years, or maybe even more. But so that I live in New York part of the year, and during that time I'm just based in New York and playing at Birdland.
Beautiful. Ooh, man, fantastic. Well, if you make it to Europe, I hope I'll catch you with this trio. It would be beautiful to hear you guys here. So
where are you located?
I'm in Slovenia, former Yugoslavia. I know with Journey you played in Ljubljana years ago. That was 10, longer. You played with Journey in Ljubljana, which is the capital of Slovenia. So I think
probably I didn't.
No, oh shit! Then Journey only played, without
because I hadn't toured with Journey, and I think the last tour I did was Frontiers tour in like 1983.
Oh yeah, then you played Yugoslavia, but you didn't.
Then I did tour with them from 2016 to 2019.
Yeah, maybe, yeah.
But in that gap, I didn't play with them, except for I did do that album, like I mentioned, Trial by Fire, but there was no touring. It was just that album.
Yeah, but
so that would have been Dean Castronova on drums.
Oh yeah, he's a monster as well.
Yeah.
But super, yeah. So I hope you make it to Europe, you guys, and then I'll catch you. And
we eventually we will.
Yeah, it's I'm
sure
killing trio. Yes. So, Steve, thanks so much again for taking the time. I appreciate it, and for sharing some of these thoughts. And really, thank
My
you.
pleasure. All right.
Keep it so strong, because you've been doing it. It's amazing. So.
All right. Thank you. I will.
Cool.
Take care. Thank you.
You too. Bye.
Bye-bye.